thank you very much, Eleanor, and hello, everybody. So, in the 15th century, England is ripped apart by civil war. 30 years of conflict in which sweeps the country, engulfing the country, and only to subside, and then months, years pass, and then once again, conflict breaks out. Now, we know this conflict as the Wars of the Roses. Two great houses, Lancaster, the Red Rose, against York, the White Rose, in a great generational struggle for the English crown. And it culminates, as we know, on the 22nd of August, 1485, at the Battle of Bosworth in the English East Midlands, in which a Lancastrian, Henry Tudor, defeats a Yorkist, Richard III, and forms a new dynasty, the House of Tudor. And the Tudor emblem also was a rose, the Tudor rose, the red rose and the white. And this was a symbol of the Tudors' ability to unify the country, to unify these two warring houses, to bring England to a position of stability, to take the country into a glorious new Tudor future. So far, so familiar. Now, this was history written by the winners, and we are rightly very skeptical of the Tudor view of history. But we still somehow, oddly, accept the Tudor view of the Wars of the Roses, this Tudor account of these 30 years. And this is odd because during these 30 years, only one family dominated England, and that wasn't the House of Lancaster, it was the White Rose, the House of York. Now, the House of York was a usurping dynasty, but it achieved a kind of magnificence and an authority and a financial stability, which was quite something in an age of great political turmoil and civil instability. Now, this instability manifested itself not just in terms of the violence, the people bludgeoning each other over the heads in muddy fields, and the body count. It manifested itself in something different, or rather, not different, but more all-pervasive. A kind of mentality. This was an age of anxiety, of mistrust, of bonds, of kinship, of family, which were destroyed. And also in a kind of opportunism as well, a sense that here power and wealth were for the taking. And this mistrust, this mentality seeps through the House of York. What I do in this book is to show that in fact the Tudors didn't win the Battle of Bosworth. Henry VII didn't win it. The Yorkists blew it. They had everything. They should have been the dynasty, in fact, that the Tudors became. They had wealth and power and authority in abundance. They were the undisputed dynasty, as I say. And what's more, they had what the Tudors didn't actually have. They had male heirs in abundance, which, of course, is a prerequisite for a dynastic monarchy. But as I say, they blew it. The House of York collapsed in on itself. And at the heart of this collapse was the relationship between three brothers. The oldest, Edward IV, the first Yorkist king of England, a flawed, compulsive, magnificent figure. The youngest, 10 years younger than Edward IV, Richard III, the king that we think we know. And in the middle, George, Duke of Clarence, who was a man who wanted to be king, kind of typical middle brother, you might say, but never was. Now, in this book, I show how their relationship went horribly wrong. They destroyed each other over a period of about 2 decades in an appalling sequence of rebellion, deposition, vendetta, fratricide, usurpation, and regicide. And one contemporary chronicler says of these brothers, he says, these three brothers possessed such surpassing talent that if they had been able to avoid conflict with each other, their triple bond could only have been broken with the utmost difficulty. Now that is one of the biggest ifs in English history. So in this book, my aim was to explore the triangular relationship between Edward, Clarence, and Richard, and to try and get into the minds, behind the eyes of each of these individual brothers, to try and show them as fully realized characters on this historical stage. And for the medieval historian, this is a very difficult task. And the reason it's difficult is quite simply because of the nature of the sources available to us. Now, the historical record at this time is quite rich, but it's very fragmentary. It's very uneven. There's a bewildering array of perspectives, of biases, as you might imagine. The sources range from chronicles to diplomats' accounts to letters, most of the letters that survive are written by people rather lower down the political food chain than these brothers in question, and also a proliferation of government records, of legal records, administrative records, financial records of all kinds. And this is one of many. This is a warrant. This is a royal warrant, and it is from Edward, the king, and it's actually giving a Christmas gift to his two young brothers. And the gift in question, that's not what I wanted to press, the gift in question is, in fact, it is a ton of wine. Now, a ton, he says, giving 2 tons of Gascon wine, he says, to be taken out of our cellars of our gift against this feast of Christmas. Now, a ton, for those of you who don't know, is a 252-gallon barrel of wine. These are young kids, so you can kind of have a sense of the atmosphere at court, right? So these records, pieced together, can tell us an awful lot about our subjects. And the first of which is Edward IV. Now, Edward IV, as I say, he was a usurper. He ascended the English throne at the age of 18, and he usurped the crown from the tremulous grasp of the Lancastrian king, Henry VI, who was a kind of anti-king. Poor man, he was mentally ill, he was hopeless. And in large part, his lack of ability was why England was in such a mess. Its politics ripped apart, its economy tanking, its government bankrupt and out of control. Sounds familiar? But Edward was the real deal as a king. He was 6'4" in his stocking feet at a time when most people were a foot shorter. His grandson, Henry VIII, in fact, was a chip off the old block. This is a magnificent, charismatic, gigantic king. And he wins 2 battles to become king, the first of which, that become indeed part of the founding Yorkist myth. And the first of these battles is a battle fought at Mortimer's Cross in the Welsh Marches on a freezing February day. And it's notable for this meteorological phenomenon called a parhelion, and as the sun rises on this freezing day, the light refracts off freezing ice crystals, and it produces 2 illusory suns either side of the real thing. And Edward and his men were quite terrified, but they win the battle, and Edward adopts this rising sun in his own personal emblem. And you can see the white rose there, and the sunburst all around it there. And then, of course, he wins a battle a few months later, which is the most bloody battle ever fought in English history. Towton in Yorkshire fought in a raging blizzard on Palm Sunday, some 28,000 people dead in one day. Edward is at the thick of it. He's in plate armor, he's fighting like a maniac. Now, at a time when monarchy is very, very personal indeed, monarchs rule, they don't just reign, they rule, and Edward does everything very intensely. He looks like a king, he walks like a king, he talks like a king. He fights, he governs brilliantly. He's very hands-on. You can see that at the top of this warrant, there is his monogram, R.E., Rex Edwardus, and he signs documents. You can see his hands, his fingerprints, his signature all over government documents of the day. And he also parties. He's a great partier, and he, as I say, he's 18. He's won his battles. This is a king who bestrides the stage. His motto, everybody has a chivalric motto at this time. His motto is "Comfort et liesse," French for comfort and joy. This king starts as he means to go on. But there's something darker at play. Edward is an excessive king as well. He does everything to excess, and he eats and drinks with fury, with a kind of furious compulsion. He's a functioning alcoholic, and his doctors, as doctors did, he stand by the table as the king eats, and they try to kind of moderate his diet, you know, and they look on, and they're pretty horrified, and they can't do anything about it. And then Edward takes emetics, so he can throw up and go back to the table and start again. He also is a rapacious womanizer. He is a predator. And he has what contemporaries called, and these are contemporaries who are actually on his side. They admire him as a king. They say he has a violent addiction to pleasure. How do we know all this? Well, we know this, as I say, through these various sources. There are these diplomats' you have diplomats' accounts of alcohol-fueled hunting parties. One Italian ambassador gets so embroiled in one of these hunting parties, Edward refuses to let him leave, and he has an attack of gout. And he says that you know, by day they're all boozing and shooting. By night there are festivities of ladies, he says diplomatically, in quotes. You can see also there's an example of these, because this is an order for another of these 252-gallon barrels of good Gascon wine, he says, that he wants put at his hunting lodges there for when he's finished shooting. You can imagine the marksmanship throughout the day gets progressively worse. And he says, so that I can have them ready there for our drinking. And our, of course, is the royal we. He means my drinking. So these sources combined and layered up begin to produce a kind of portrait of a king. And he has a raging temper. He's capable of losing it. And this really comes through the officialese of these documents. You get a sense of this personal anger sometimes that when people won't obey him. There's one letter, a wonderful letter that an associate of a Norfolk knight, Sir John Paston, writes to him saying, when this man Paston has failed to turn up to court, he says, you have to come to the court. He says, or the king will kill you. And, quote, he means what he says. You know, Edward is also, later on, chroniclers describe him as being feared by all his subjects. When another courtier fails to come to court and finally turns up, he turns up to this packed court full of hangers-on. He prostrates himself at the king's feet. And Edward just estranges his gaze. He just looks away from him like that. And that is enough for the entire court to turn their backs on this guy who wanders out friendless, alone, and out of favour. So Edward he's also becomes paranoid and unpredictable. He's what one Italian diplomat contemptuously describes as a tavern bush. He's an ensign swinging in the wind. He's what we might call a flip-flopper. And so this is an explosive combination. It's a king who is unpredictable, who is very dangerous, who people tiptoe around. He's a king who is quite capable of killing his own brother, which he does. He kills his own brother Clarence in 1478 by drowning him in one of these 252-gallon barrels of wine. Dark humour, and in fact a reflection of Clarence's alcoholism as well as Richard's, you might say. All of which brings us to the younger brother, Richard III. Now that is Edward, again, and that is Richard III, the younger brother. Now one of the main reasons why I wrote this book is to try and understand the aim of this most controversial of English kings, an extraordinarily dark, concentrated 2-year period of English history. Richard is 8 when Edward becomes king, and in his formative years, of course, have this profound instability, this sense of this is a boy who never, ever knows stability. He's constantly on the move. He's exiled when he's 8, flees into exile, and then returns. But of course, it's also, as I say, this time of opportunism. His family, his dynasty, the House of York, has acquired extraordinary wealth and power. But in the middle of all this, Richard is a boy, and then a man who craves stability. He craves order. He craves clarity. And he finds these things not in real life, which is messy, but he finds them in the abstract ideals that he finds in books. And he's a great reader, the ideals of chivalry, of justice, of loyalty, and piety. And these ideas, he wants to impose them on life as he sees it in order to try and make sense of it. And we can see it again in another of these documents. Now, this is a book that belongs to Richard. It's a romance, a chivalric romance of Ipomedon, the greatest knight in all the world. And we can see at the bottom here, Richard's signature, Richard R. Gloucester. And above it, his motto, Tant le désiré, which is French for I have wanted it so much. He wants to be like this knight here. Now, he's full of passionate intensity, Richard. He has the binary view of the world. Good, evil, white, black, virtue and vice. He's incredibly brave. This manifests itself in a great bravery. He's a very slight man. Chroniclers describe him as being very slight but has great heart. I'm being told to hurry up, so I shall. And one chronicler says, I suppose he's the same as clerks have read, he says. He's the kind of knight who you read about in books. And of course, Richard has read about these knights in books. Now he is one. In 1483, I'm going to skip ahead, Edward dies. He dies rather as Henry VIII, his grandson was to die. He dies fat and bloated, and there you can see Edward with his multiple chins, fat old 40-year-old Edward. This is not a flattering portrait. And Richard usurps. Edward has been a very strong king. In this atmosphere of anxiety, Richard usurps the kingdom. Now, what Richard does, chroniclers say, is he is to the extreme detriment of the kingdom and the utter subversion of his own house, the ultimate destruction of the House of York, because what Richard does is to usurp the throne from Richard's oldest son, who's only 12. He's a minor. He can reign, but he can't rule because he's too young. He usurps the throne, and he becomes Richard III. And he puts Edward's oldest son and his brother in the Tower. They're never seen again. Now, Richard's, as I say, he's a very rigid character. This binary view of the world, it serves him very well as Edward's right-hand man. It serves him very well on the battlefield, but very poorly as king. His ideals disintegrate on contact with reality, and there's a kind of cognitive dissonance. Richard can't bear it. He can't bear the messiness of life. He tries to straighten it out, so he starts killing people. You see where I'm coming to here. Now, this inflexibility causes his downfall at Bosworth, and it's very interesting because Bosworth, which we think of as this great battle between House of Lancaster, the House of York. It's not. It's a faction fight between two sides of the House of York, those loyal to Richard, those loyal to Edward IV and the memory of his sons, the boys who we know as the princes in the Tower. And it's a faction fight. It's white on white. And the most extraordinary comment on Richard's reign, I think, is that the faction loyal to Edward IV and the princes turn to a man who has barely any claim to the throne at all. He only has a smattering of royal blood, and he's a Lancastrian. He's Henry Tudor. Now, that in itself is a damning comment on Richard III's rule. Now, I'm running out of time. I've run out of time, but what about the princes you want to hear, okay? So I'm going to leave you with the princes, and we're not going to go into that, but I want to leave you with one document. This is a document which I found in Kew, and to my knowledge, nobody's really come across it, which is extraordinary. It's dated September 1484, about a year after the princes in the Tower have gone missing. And it is a pension to a man called Miles Forrest, who was the keeper of the wardrobe at Richard's Castle of Barnard in County Durham. And it's a pension to his wife and son, basically giving them Miles Forrest's salary for as long as either of them shall live. Now, Thomas More talked about Miles Forrest, and he mentioned him in one context. He said he was one of the murderers of the princes in the Tower. Now, Clements Markham, who was a great 19th century historian, defender of Richard III, he said he knew about this document, but he didn't know about this particular document. It's mentioned elsewhere in Richard's accounts. And he says, no way is this anything other than a payment for long service. Miles Forrest was a long-established servant of Richard's, and this is just simply, that's the kind of thing kings did. Well, they didn't do that, because kings couldn't even afford most of the time to pay their own household servants when they were living. They didn't pay pensions to their servants, to their families after they were dead. Otherwise, they would go bankrupt. And this is not a payment for long service. This is a payment for something else. And this account tells us what it is. It says, this is Richard's personal order, and it's written out by his secretary. And he says, it's for diverse causes and considerations us moving. Now, this is a formula. This isn't just any old wording. Diverse causes and considerations us moving was a phrase that kings used when they wanted to make a payment for confidential secret service done on their behalf. Well, we don't know what Miles Forrest did for Richard, but it was something very, very exceptional. And for me, this is a great example of the kind of archival work that one does as a historian. And it shows the devil in the detail, that in these apparently mundane official documents, you can come across things like this. And it's one of the reasons why I find what I do so very surprising, so exciting, so richly rewarding. Thank you very much.